Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. Joining me today is Daniel Francavilla to talk about nonprofit marketing. Danielle, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
So, my first typical question asking all my guests is what is your superhero origin story? That is to say, how did you get started working with nonprofits?
Love that. So I actually started working with nonprofits by launching my own nonprofit back when I was in high school. And I didn't know too much about the time at the time about the technicalities behind that, but ended up figuring it out. I was 16 and eventually fully incorporated it when I was 18. And I went on this exposure trip, they called it, to the Dominican Republic, where I got to learn what life was like for a lot of the world that lives with, significantly less resources than we do here in North America. So I'm from just outside of Toronto, Canada, and grew up in a suburb. And so for me, that was a big culture shock. And I got to see what are some of the needs, things that we take for granted. And I was really inspired to kind of take action as a young person. And so I ended up launching this organization, spoke at all kinds of schools and churches and organizations, and did conferences and events, and got some grant funding on my own. So I learned a little bit about the process there, building a team, getting funding, going through the board processes. But then I went into the industry, which was not the nonprofit sector. I went into design, learned about marketing and advertising, and went on to really find out how I could use design as a way to support social good efforts in the nonprofit space. And so eventually, fast forward to today, I ended up going back to now support nonprofit organizations with my skill sets. But to answer your question, Alex, I'll go back to my origin story there. I was really just this unsuspecting, keen 15-year-old high school kid who signed up for an exposure trip, went to the trip at 16, and came back and started taking action from a grassroots perspective in my local community.
Travel is awesome. I envy you to a certain extent to be able to travel so far so early because I think that really opened your mind to, hey, like you said, not everyone is as fortunate as we are. And
Hmm.
therefore, let's keep a more humble global perspective on things as opposed to, entitlement.
Yeah, absolutely. You really realize, how much you do have when you're in a situation like that, where, kids are coming up to you because they want to learn English, right? Or they want the snacks that you have in your bag, right? Like it's very interesting. And I was so inspired by their hunger to learn, whether it was to learn English, to be able to get to, continue with school. Most kids didn't, finish high school at that point. And and so to see their passion and their efforts and interest in that, it really inspired me to want to help them out. And I thought it was more of a social justice thing. Like it's so obvious, why can't we help them? Why shouldn't they be able to go to school? And one of those things that stopped them was simply that they didn't have school uniforms. School uniform and shoes were kind of this barrier that I saw. So that was kind of the immediate spark as part of my, as you say, superhero origin story. I wanted to, support them on that. Of course, I learned that there was a lot bigger issues at play in the world, and socioeconomic issues, geopolitical issues, all of this stuff. But at least I was kind of inspired to take that spark and take action and start an organization.
And then fast forward, like you said, a few years later, you decided to move toward marketing and then share that knowledge with nonprofits. Why go back to the nonprofit world? Was it really because of these earlier experiences, or was there some deeper calling that you had?
I think, the experiences that I had kind of gave me that firsthand insight into the challenges and the resource limitations that nonprofits face. But it was kind of natural for me to continue working with nonprofits as clients at the time. So I ran a creative agency for about 11 years. I joined forces with some partners, so it was acquired during the pandemic, and I stayed on for a few more years up until just the end of 2024. And at the time, in the early days, I got to do all kinds of pro bono work for nonprofits. I would, sponsor events. do projects with nonprofits. We even did some RFPs to work with charities. So my passion kind of continued along, wanting to support those organizations. And I think, it's so important to help to help organizations tell their stories, clarify their mission, and build stronger brands. And so I thought, hey, I got this skill set. I went to school for design, and I studied marketing and social. Um, you know what? How can I apply this, right? How can I apply this for social good? And I think it was something that, that same inspiration as a high school student, me wanting to take action. I think it was that same motivation that got me to continue working with nonprofits.
Awesome. We're glad to have you because marketing is a broad and deep and vast area that a lot of organizations struggle with, myself included, actually. So you said maybe we can talk more specifically about what kind of things you offer because it is such an exciting technology, right? There's so many different aspects of it in terms of marketing. So maybe you could talk a bit about, what are the main pillars or areas of focus within marketing that you like to help with?
Absolutely. And I guess I should note that, after kind of exiting the agency, I did kind of double down into my own consulting practice. And that's where I got to really, focus on the organizations and the type of work that I love doing the most, that I can make the most impact. Sometimes it takes time to get there, right? Where you got to do everything for everyone, and then eventually you can niche down, right?
Right.
So for me, I help organizations tell their story, build their brand, and ultimately make more impact. Some of the ways that I do that, the number one way is through advising. So I do marketing advising on an ongoing basis with organizations. I call it nonprofit impact advisory, but really it's about marketing advising, things like messaging. I work with organizations, associations, leaders, and their teams. At the end of the day, it's to help them clarify their message in the first place and then amplify their impact. And I think it's so important to note that, if you are a nonprofit or a charity, you want to work, you want to leverage the world of the powerful resources that come with the world of marketing, design, branding, communication, social media. But a lot of times, there's a little bit of a conflict there with the language that's used, right, in the marketing and advertising space versus the language that's used in the social impact space. And for me, it's not about marketing buzzwords. It's about helping, these organizations to tell their story in a way that inspires action, helps them to build stronger connections with donors, with supporters, and with their communities. And really, I want to be able to, as an advisor, I want to be able to help these nonprofit leaders focus their time and resources on the strategies that actually work and doing what they do best, right? As opposed to, struggling to figure out how to give instructions to a team member on what to post on a certain social media app, right? So yeah, that's a little bit about the work that I do. And oftentimes, the advising will lead to other projects. So things like a branding strategy, brand strategy, a new web project. I won't be the one that's, developing the website, although that is how I got my start in the early days. I was freelance designing, freelance web developing, doing everything. Um, but I like to help those organizations turn that into something that they can use, whether, like I said, it's a campaign, it's a video series, it's a website. I will enable them by providing that direct advising, support, and strategy, and then I work with collaborators and partners to implement those things.
Given all this experience, which is quite broad, how do you start in the sense of how do you typically help organizations clarify their message? And even before that, do organizations know they have an issue with clarifying their message before you are engaged? Or is that
Hmm.
typically like what are the symptoms basically of the problem that they're experiencing uh, for a nonprofit to say, you know what, maybe we need a bit of help, clarifying our message?
Yeah, I think sometimes it does take someone who, on the inside of the organization, has some level of understanding of, either from a fundraising perspective, a communications perspective, or marketing. They know that something's not aligned, right? It comes out in this misalignment, right? Sometimes it's simply that they don't have the right resources, the right team members in house. So it's like a staffing or capacity issue. But other times, it's often hard to identify the problems you're facing from the inside because you understand the work that you do. You know what your mission is, you know what your values are, right? But oftentimes you're not necessarily able to realize what others are not seeing and that it might not be so obvious to everyone out there. And I think that's really important to think about is that you know your story, but you might not be telling it as clearly. That's that same understanding that you have might not be what the general public is seeing through your materials. And so I think that misalignment is something that leaders can identify, whether it's from them, whether it's their board member that realizes it, or whether they do a little bit of an audit to kind of unpack that.
And then once you step in, how do you help cultivate or clarify that message? Like, what are you typically high level steps? What do you look for? Like, because I know tone, content, audience,
Mhm.
all these things are extremely important. I assume also we're talking about mostly written content more than video content, but it could be anything, right? So, like, is it a matter of determining that certain personas, who your audience should be or would like to be? Is it a matter of driving impact? Like, what kind of levers do you use to help clarify their message?
Absolutely, yeah. It all depends on exactly what their goals are, but typically from, I like to take a brand first approach, and even though that might sound like something that's more from the, for-profit world, um, nonprofits do have brands, whether they, own that or identify that or not, right? So I like to kind of go through in a discovery session, uncover those challenges, set those, priorities, and, the best thing that I can do, depending on the project, is do stakeholder consultations, right? Well, I will actually get out there and interview members of their team, their volunteers, their partners, you know, external people from the community, people that they serve. Doing those sessions really, really helps to identify the value and the needs, and try to see what that potential disconnect is. So I like to start with that. That's the research process, the stakeholder consultations, and then move into brand messaging, which really helps to distill that down. Nothing is really done until you test it, though, of course, right? So, from a process standpoint, you always want to be testing it internally and externally a little bit first, and then turning that into, at the end of the day, you've got this new, updated, refined positioning, messaging that can then be turned into, copy for your website. I usually, because I have a background in design, I can give some visual identity guidelines and visual standards as well, and taking right taking them right through to a social media or a content strategy. And because I've had experience working in the agency space and even running a content studio, I'm able to advise on that as well.
Would you say, because I've heard the expression finding your voice, would you say the expression finding your voice is the same thing as clarifying your message, or is there a difference between the two?
I think finding your voice is definitely connected to that. However, I think the finding your voice piece is unique to the leadership, right? I think looking at what a nonprofit organization is made up of people, whether it's the founders, whether it's the board members, whether it's the staff or the executive director, that those individuals have to also find their voice. And that all starts with knowing your why. And it might be a little bit different for each person on the team, but I think it starts with clarity, right? Knowing your why, owning your personal story, and what values you bring to the table as a leader or as a team member working for a cause, right? And your voice doesn't necessarily have to be loud, but it has to be authentic and it has to be clear. So that's one of the things that I do work on is helping nonprofit leaders find their voice. And I've done a lot of workshops and training and sessions when it comes to things like personal branding and thought leadership on that regard.
So, what I'm hearing is that not only should the organization have their message, their voice, but the leader of the organization should have a slightly different voice or their own unique voice. Like, how do those two, I guess they don't want to compete with each other. How do they add to each other to make sure that it's even a stronger message than just, one or the other?
Yeah, I think that's really important is that you want to have your unique, your own unique personality showing through for sure. But it still has to be aligned, and it goes deeper than just the messaging, the copywriting, the style that you communicate goes deeper into, the mission, the vision, and the values, right? You can have two people that share the same values, they're very much aligned on their mission, but they can communicate in totally different ways. And I think that that is actually okay today. People nowadays are following individuals, they're following personalities, they're not following brands as much. So they actually want that variation and that variety. And so, when you ask an individual team member what they care deeply about, they may have a different answer, but their overall, values are going to be aligned, right? And they have their own unique perspective and their unique lived experience that they bring to the cause and to the organization. So I think at the end of the day, it's about aligning your voice with the mission of the organization while still showing up as a real person. You're not just a spokesperson, right? You're a real person with your own views and experiences.
And you're saying that doing the 1-2 combo is actually much better approach than just having one organization do it without the voice. Like, I guess I'm still trying to figure out and understand how not important, maybe impactful would be the right word. But the idea is that because it's one person to follow. It's one thing to follow a person, and I get the idea of wanting to make stronger connections, and the other, of course, connecting with an organization. And I know that I get that they have to be aligned as well. But I guess I'm trying to see is like, is it a situation where you always recommend having those two aligned voices, or do you normally say maybe for smaller organizations, as long as you have a voice to start with, that's good enough, and then
Yeah.
maybe later on you can cultivate it to have two separate threads.
Yeah, I think to be clear, like your message needs to be clear, right?
Mhm.
I think from there should be no confusion. When someone goes to your website or when you're at an event, you should be able to clearly say what your unique value proposition is, right? What your mission is, your vision. That needs to be aligned no matter who's saying it. But people can speak about it in their own style and using their own voice. And that's important because I might connect with you, Alex, but I might not relate to another person, right? And so you want to be able to appeal to a variety of individuals. And like I mentioned before, authenticity is so important that you want people to do it in their own style. Otherwise, it might come across as they're just, pushing a message on you, right?
Mm. And I guess I would like to talk about AI a bit later on, but I imagine that it's easy and to outsource some part of this to AI to kind of build that voice for you and just copy paste it, which I imagine you're going to say that's a really, really bad idea. But I'm curious to know if you can talk a bit more about why that's such a bad idea.
Absolutely. I mean, it comes down to, there are ways, AI is a tool. So there are ways that you can, program and set things up. And I don't want to get too technical just yet, but I think if you think about the idea of thought leadership, right? What is thought leadership? Well, it's ultimately using your own expertise and your own experience to contribute meaningfully to some type of conversations or content that's happening in your space, right? And thought leadership is what helps build that trust, not just with donors and funders, but with everyone, community members, staff, partners, your colleagues, right? So for nonprofit leaders, using your voice and crafting it in a way that resonates with that audience and is true to you, I think that's your chance to represent your mission beyond just, a logo or an annual report, right? It gives a face and a voice to the impact that you're making. Um, and again, like I think from this perspective today, like people want real, they want real, relatable stuff. So there's that aspect of that you get from an individual sharing things that you won't really get from, the organization itself.
I keep hearing this term thought leadership, and it constantly reminds me of just trying to build an authority in a certain space in a certain region. And maybe the word people don't like the word authority in the nonprofit space, but to me, that's just building credibility, becoming a leader.
Yep.
Would you say that there's a lot of overlap between the two, or they're exactly the same, or they're completely different?
No, there's absolutely overlap. I think that what's so important to recognize is that in the nonprofit space, people are doing this. Many of the people that are doing this because they're passionate about it, right? They're mission driven, but they may they may not want to focus the attention on themselves, right? But in business, that actually works really well, right? You've got founders, there's all kinds of famous founders out there. There's CEOs in the news, there's board members and investors all over the place that they have a very public presence, and that benefits the company so much. So I like to reframe it to, help founders, so help leaders in the nonprofit space and help employees in the nonprofit space to understand that, hey, they can actually use thought leadership to help the organization to really benefit it, and it builds that trust. It's a combination of sharing that knowledge and expertise with, adding your own voice and your own personality, right? And I think if you talk about it from a content strategy, that's really where it comes to life, right? Where does all this thought leadership go? Well, it can go into content, right? And content is essentially, um, you know, anything that you post, whether it's a video, a newsletter, social media caption, anything like that. And so with this thought leadership that you've developed and this kind of identity that you've developed, it can give you that consistent theme or narrative for your content. And that's a lot more compelling than just, updates and making asks, right?
Absolutely. And when it comes to content, is there trends? Because I mean, I'm sure every nonprofit's different, and different content will work will work better and differently for other nonprofits. But have you noticed any trends in terms of generally, do people prefer more videos these days? Do they prefer more, selfies type talking, or do they prefer more news or just content or shorts? Short videos these days are all the rage, or at least they used to be about a year ago. So I'm curious to know if you see any trends in content and where a nonprofit should typically invest their attention.
Yeah, because we're, talking a lot about thought leadership today, I think that you do need to look at where your audience actually is. And, if your role is, you're in charge of development or fundraising, or you're, a board member, president, or you're the executive director, at the end of the day, you need to be aware, you know, fellow donors are, fellow executives are, leaders, right? And platforms like LinkedIn are really emerging as a strong one where nonprofit leaders are sharing their content, sharing their wins, their successes, making some, compelling cases by profiling the work that they're doing. But they're also getting raw and sharing like, hey, this is the data. These are the stats, right? Like this is the problem. This is what we need support with. And it's not necessarily about making an ask, but it's about clearly identifying what the challenge is, right? And I think, using that thought leadership as a content strategy, instead of just promoting events or fundraising goals, you're sharing your perspectives, you're giving insights, right? You're letting people in from behind the scenes processes and thinking. And that actually encourages people to follow you because they want to know what's happening with these issues. They want to know what's going on in the sector. And so if you're a leader, if you're a staff member, you can go out there and, talk about current issues in the sector, talk about current events, write your reflections on lessons learned from one of your recent programs, share the founding journey or the founding story, profiling other people that have supported your organization as well. That all helps to create this long-term, content loop and this visibility that positions you and your organization as a leader in your niche. And at the end of the day, we can dive into storytelling as well, but at the end of the day, people will follow and they'll stay engaged if you're telling those compelling stories.
I definitely want to get to storytelling, but before we get there, I watched this guy on YouTube. He does woodworking, and what's interesting about him is I don't do woodworking myself, but I appreciate what he does. He does good quality work. He has a fantastic voiceover as he's doing the process. And he's very humble about it. He talks about his mistakes, he talks about errors, he talks about oops and along the way. And I find that grounds him quite a bit. It makes him really seem human. And again, he makes fantastic work and he charges a tremendous amount of money for it now. But because he points out his faults and then corrects them, I find it humanizes him so much more. So I'm curious to know, is that a tactic that is a good idea to share with people? Like it's part of the behind the scenes strategy of saying, or we're all human, we make mistakes. there can be an element of genuineness about it. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but it definitely humanizes people, which
Mhm.
might be a bit contradictory to, we know exactly what we're doing. We're always on the happy path, and you should follow us. Versus we maybe not make mistakes along the way, but we falter, we get resistance sometimes, but we persevere. I'm just curious to know your perspective on, how much should you show behind the scenes, and how much should you show about mistakes or faults along the way.
Absolutely. That's a really delicate balance, but people do gravitate towards that. I spoke about authenticity earlier. That's the number one way to show it, right? It's not just about this like totally polished content all the time. And in fact, if you're trying to resonate with like a younger audience, let's say with Gen Z, they actually prefer that more raw, organic looking content, and sharing those examples of, you know, situations where, hey, we messed up. We're being transparent about this, but this is what we learned, right? That is important because it's accountability, and it shows that you're, willing to take ownership and not hide and be transparent, and that does work really well. So I love the example you mentioned there. I think that that is certainly something that we're going to see a lot more of as people realize, hey, it's not going to, destroy your reputation to share some of these behind the scenes things, to share, moments of failure or questioning or making mistakes, and to show like, what's quote unquote under the hood, right? Show, what are some of the conversations that are happening? What does the process really look like? Let's say you're planning a major fundraiser or a major event. What does that actually look like? Oh, you're having issues with a venue, securing a venue, something happened, something got canceled. Don't be afraid to share that, because guess what? Someone might actually step up, right? Someone might actually want to step up and help. Um, and when they do go to the event, they'll realize how much, they'll appreciate a little bit more how much went into it. So that's just an example of how you can kind of be more transparent.
I agree. Actually, a lot of people just see the end product, and they don't necessarily see all the work and effort and failures
Mhm.
and reattempts along the way. They just see this polished product that, might have taken months or years to build up, or to host, or all the previous events that were maybe not as successful as the current one. So I think sharing your journey along the way and being authentic, like you said, is definitely a very powerful message. I was wondering if you could combine that with, into storytelling. Like, what does storytelling mean to you? And, what makes it so powerful?
Absolutely. When it comes to storytelling, I think humans are wired for stories. You've probably heard this before, right? We literally, this goes back to the origins of, living in caves and putting markings everywhere, and, telling these stories to pass down to generations. So humans are wired for stories. It's how we make sense of the world. It's also how we remember things. And I think today a good story is something that humanizes data. There's all kinds of data, facts, stats, all kinds of stuff out there. It humanizes it. It makes your impact tangible, right? And it invites people in to really learn more and follow along. So um, I think it's also how people emotionally connect with a cause. There's some really compelling stats out there, but a stat could just, a stat can inform you, but a story can move you. I think that's what's really important to resonate, to remember when you're talking about sharing these stories versus just, well, look, our report has all these great stats. You really got to get the stories to hook people and compel them to take action.
I love that quote. Stats can inform you, stories can move you. I might write that one down and keep it.
Absolutely. And I think, if you're looking for ways to, um, you know, identify good storytelling, or to perhaps try to, do that yourself. I think one of those things is relatable people, relatable characters, right? Ideally, someone that the audience can empathize with in the story, whether that's you, or whether that's someone that your organization has served, or whether it's a staff member or a donor, right? Another thing that's important about good storytelling is having some kind of conflict and resolution, right? What is the challenge that you went through? How did your organization help overcome that? Or how are you currently dealing with this challenge? Another one is the use of emotion, as I mentioned earlier, emotion and getting really specific. The more vivid, the more memorable the story, that's what's going to really help you to capture people. And then, of course, there's no point telling these stories if it doesn't tie back to your mission and what the audience can do to support it, right? So you want to make that clear link with the story and your work and your mission.
These are also seem to be well, these also seem to be similar traits of a good movie too, right? You want relatable characters, you want conflict because if it's everything is happy and go lucky and perfect and utopian, then that's kind of boring. You want to evoke emotions and create some kind of drama to a certain extent, some kind of conflict, and then yeah, tying it back to a happy ending or to a story or to a moral or to something else. So I can see that being extremely powerful if you can manage all four of those attributes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you are in marketing, let's say, and you talk about content, it's not just content, right? It's not just words. It's not just like putting a graphic up. It's like thinking about that from a story perspective and the story you're telling. And that also extends into conversations about fundraising, making asks, doing presentations, having meetings. Find ways that you could include, good stories within that because that will really help humanize it and help people to resonate.
While doing research for this podcast recording, I was browsing one of your articles on your website, and I came across something that I thought was interesting. And I was curious to know if you could share. There are two profound shifts in nonprofit marketing that you wrote about. I was wondering if you could explain a bit about what those are and some details about them.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think I'll talk a little bit about there's many shifts, but I think two of the most profound shifts in nonprofit marketing would be moving from brand centric to people centric, as I alluded to earlier, right? Organizations used to lead with, the brand. Here's who we are, right? You can picture some logos of some very famous large charities, I'm sure, in your mind, right? Um, but now it's shifted to things like, here's who we serve and here's how you can be part of the story. So I think moving from brand centric to people centric is a really important one. And then of course the second shift that we're seeing a lot of is moving from campaign focus. Let's say one big annual appeal, or let's say a holiday campaign. They're moving from that to being always on and really kind of building up a presence and being top of mind. So nonprofits used to turn on marketing around these annual fundraising drives or events or holidays. But now you need an ongoing presence. Really, you can't just emerge once a year, right? Social media moves so fast, content moves so quickly, news cycles are so short. So you need that ongoing presence, right? Whether it's newsletters, whether it's, organic social, whether it's, long form content like YouTube videos or even having a show or a podcast, right? That makes room for deeper storytelling that needs to be ongoing, it needs to be continuous. And that helps keep your mission top of mind and build deeper relationships. So I would say brand centric, moving from brand centric to people centric, and then moving from campaign focused to being always on.
So if I put myself in the head of the listener, the first thing that I would react to is this always on because sometimes you have limited time, limited resources, and always on sounds exhausting and could be difficult to keep up. So maybe you could give a bit more details about what you mean by always on. Like the impression I get if I was putting on my hat again as the host here is that what it means is you don't wait, or don't do it 2 or 3 times a year, but you do it is maybe snippets or bite-sized throughout the year, not always on, meaning 24 hours, 7 days a week, but more like on a more frequent basis at a smaller content level. And then you may have the
Mhm.
annual ones or the semi-annual events that are much larger, those kinds of campaigns. Would that be more or less what you were thinking of as well, or did you have something else in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just finding ways that people can engage with you at any point in time, right? And not just, you know, the one time of year where they're trying to, issue their tax receipt or something like that, right? Where they're trying to make a donation to get a tax receipt at the end of the year. It's keeping the conversation going, right? What are ways that they can keep in mind, keep you top of mind? What are ways that they can engage with you? What's something that they can share with their audience throughout? So that's really what I mean by that.
And going back to the first point you mentioned, brand centric to people centric. So my understanding is that you just want to have it's more a person talking to a person, or is it versus a brand talking to a person, or a brand talking to a brand? Like what is that really that shift? I'm missing one piece of it to understand what that shift means from brand centric to people centric.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, like I said, if you go back to organizations leading with their brand, so let's just say a massive one is United Way, right, or Salvation Army. They lead with their for decades, many decades. They've led with their logo. It's identifiable. You have an idea of what they do. If you ask people on the street, most likely they identify what it is by their brand. But it's about moving beyond that because, first of all, there's a lot more competition now. But the people centric approach is to move to things like, here's who we are, here's who we serve, here's how you can be part of it. And people want to connect with people, not institutions. That's where, when I spoke earlier about, thought leadership, that's what they want, right? They want to be able to connect and they want to be able to resonate with individuals. They build those relationships. So brand centric, a people centric approach in nonprofits could look like, you know, showcasing the people you serve as the heroes of your story, right? The organization is the guide or the enabler. They're not the hero. Whereas
Mm.
before, people would see as this big charity, they're the hero. We got to support them. We got to bring them up. We got to get them all the recognition they need. But the people you serve are the heroes of the story. So, you want messaging around real individuals, their experiences, their challenges, their failures, even, right? And then their transformations. Instead of pushing a brand, you're sharing lived experiences and you're building that trust through authentic storytelling over time. Um, and I think you can also summarize it by it's about showing, not just telling, what your impact looks like through the eyes of your community. Um, that's hard to argue with, right? That's a lot more powerful when the community is telling their story, as opposed to you as a brand, as a nonprofit, issuing some type of statement or annual report, saying we did X, Y, Z. Here's our numbers. Here's our stats. You trust us because you know our name, right?
Thank you for those examples. Actually, that really clinched it for me. I think, and I really resonate with the enabler. Like the nonprofit should be the enabler and the guide, not the hero. That the people you're helping
Mhm.
are the heroes. I think that's a beautiful way to phrase it.
Absolutely, yeah. It's important. It is a shift, right? Like to make the shift, I think it's about putting again your clients, your community members, and your frontline staff at the center of your storytelling and letting people speak for themselves, right? Whether that's quotes, video interviews, behind the scenes photos, with permission, of course. You got to make sure everyone is on board. But highlighting those journeys and there's impact, not just like input output. We raised X amount. We supported this number of people. Prioritizing that human connection over the more polished side. And to your question earlier, real is more relatable at the end of the day.
Mm. So looking forward, I'm curious to know if you had a crystal ball and it was 100% accurate, what would you predict in terms of nonprofit marketing? Like, where do you see things trends? You can throw an AI in here as well too, because obviously that's becoming predominant in various different ways. So, where would you picture the state of nonprofit marketing in the next 2 to 5 years?
Yeah, for sure. We know technology and AI is going to play a major role, but to clarify, not to replace humans, of course, but to automate the more administrative side of marketing, the things like reporting, looking for data, summarizing, conversations, transcripts, that kinds of things. So that teams can actually focus on storytelling and relationship building. That's super, super important. So I would say we'll see a lot more examples of tech and AI there, helping you to get. It really does help you to get more content out at scale. And I've done some workshops on this as well. Another thing that I would say for the future of nonprofit marketing is more personalization and more authenticity. We're still There's still a lot more room for that. I think funders and supporters want that real connection. The organizations that show up as humans will be the ones that win. Finding unique ways to personalize their content, their communications, and really make those supporters and donors feel connected and seen. Another one I'll go back to is the whole idea of, we spoke about thought leadership, but that comes down to increased presence for founders, like founder leader visibility, right? People trust people, not logos, right? Personal brands, I think, will become more important. I've seen some great examples of this already. I mentioned LinkedIn as an example. There's all kinds of leaders that I see in the space that are really stepping up and building that relationship over time, representing their organization super, super well. And not just when there's a press release once or twice a year. And yeah, and finally, I think another thing, and I'm actually doing a talk about this as well, is the whole idea of community powered marketing, where you're really empowering your audience, your volunteers, your clients, sponsors, getting them to tell their stories on your behalf. Um, it really it really does go a long way when other people are being advocates and ambassadors for you. So I think I mentioned four there. I think those are probably my predictions there, without getting too much into the technical side of things. I think eventually, from a prediction perspective, just the same way that we kind of follow and idolize some of the famous, tech and startup founders, um, I think that perhaps that will happen as well with nonprofit leaders.
I would love to see that. Like, it was a big movement, I don't know how many years ago, where chefs, at the time were no one special, and all of a sudden celebrity chefs became a thing, and now celebrities chefs are highlighted and
Yeah,
glorified and all that kind of stuff. So, wouldn't it be great if the people who are really making a difference in the community, they get to be a celebrity of some kind as well? So that would be a wonderful thing, I think.
absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely an opportunity for that, and they deserve the recognition, but and the presence. But more importantly, the causes are there. They're doing such great work, and people just need another way to. It's another avenue, another vehicle for people to get there.
Definitely. Well, listen, Danielle, this has been great. Lots of information here. I'm hoping people will have questions for you. Where can they get in touch with you and follow you online?
Absolutely. So I have a few resources and things that people can download as well. I would recommend going to the goodgrowth.company. That's actually my website. It's a training business that I started, an upskilling company for nonprofits and purpose-driven organizations that are looking to, invest in their people. I think that's the way to help scale their mission, is to really invest in their people. So the goodgrowth.company is the website, but there's a personal branding guide. So if you go to the goodgrowth.company/personal branding guide, you can actually download a bunch of questions that you can ask as a nonprofit or charity leader for free, that can, help you to answer these questions, to get really clear on who you are and what your message is. And if you're interested in learning more about what I do in general, from a speaking perspective, from a brand strategy, marketing, advising, you can check out danieldoes.co. And of course, feel free to follow me on LinkedIn, Daniel Francavilla.
Danielle, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciate all of your effort with this podcast, and helping to provide resources to support the nonprofit community.
It's my pleasure. All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.